Reflections of Love. To build up one another, we must demonstrate Christ's love in all of our relationships. Here's Gene.
After telling these believers, and Paul personalizes this and he says, look, if I had the language gifts and I spoke with the tongues of men and even of angels, and we're really not sure about that because there's a difference of opinion as to whether there were language gifts that were literal, like on the day of Pentecost, where they heard them speak in their languages. Those were languages, all the dialects from the Roman Empire. Or whether this was some kind of heavenly language through some kind of aesthetic utterance where the spirit is praying and the mind is not. There's some difference of opinion exactly what this is all about. But Paul says, look, if I have the gifts of language of men and of angels and have not love, it doesn't matter. I'm nothing if I don't have love. And if I have the gift of prophecy and faith and all these things, have not love, I'm nothing. And then, this is the most fascinating thing. He goes on in this passage and contrasts what love is with what they are not. And so we have this summary, where in verse 4 he says, look, love is patient, love is kind, love does not envy. And basically, back in chapter 3, he says you're impatient, unkind, and envious. You're going to see that he goes back and summarizes with what love is with what they're not. I think that he raised some hair on the back of their necks with this one. Not because they were shocked, but because they probably got mad. He goes on to say, love is not boastful. It is not conceited. In chapter 3 and 4, he says, you're demonstrating the opposite of love with your boastful and arrogant attitudes. He talks about that. He uses that language. In verse 5, he says, love does not act improperly, is not selfish. And of course, in chapter 11, they were rude and self-seeking and even getting drunk at the communion table and eating up all the food and not caring about the poor. And Paul is saying that's the ultimate in rudeness and self-seeking. In verse 5, the latter part of verse 5, love is not provoked, does not keep a record of wrongs. Chapter 6, he says, you're having public disputes and going to pagan law courts. That's not love. And in chapter 6, or verse 6, he says, love finds no joy in unrighteousness, rejoices in the truth. And you're improving and even bragging about immoral behavior in the church that isn't even practiced among the pagans, incest. In verse 7, he said, love bears all things. And in chapter 8, he said, you're causing weaker Christians to stumble. You're not even bearing with each other. You're going down to pagan temples. You could care less about what that does to people. They stumble, they fall, because they don't distinguish between what is an idol and what is a true God. And they eat the meat, and they stumble, they fall, they fail, they go back into immorality, which was a part of that whole system within the temples. And he says, that's not love. And then he talks about believing all things, and some of them no longer even trusted Paul, and he led them to Christ. And he said, that's not love. If you don't have trust, there's no love. Now, you see what he's done here? This is the most fascinating thing. He, within 3 verses, summarizes everything he said, basically, from chapter 1 all the way through chapter 9, to demonstrate to them that they don't have any love. And this is the most complete profile of what love is you'll find in the whole New Testament. With the exception, of course, of what he says in Galatians, where he talks about the fruit of the Spirit, and that leads to the question. How does this paragraph describe the fruit of the Holy Spirit in our Christian relationships? And here we read in Galatians 5, and some believe that this is actually the way you can exegete this passage. The fruit of the Spirit is love, the greatest of these. That's foundational. And out of love grows joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and faith and gentleness, self-control. Against such things there is no law. And basically what Paul does there in 1 Corinthians 13 in those 3 verses is really describe the fruit of the Holy Spirit. They had the gifts of the Spirit more than any other church, but they weren't manifesting the fruit of the Spirit. And consequently, they had no love. Now, from this point, he goes to how to measure maturity. How to measure corporate maturity. And I think this would be a good point at which we could take a break. And we'll pick up because I want to take a little time on this, because this is where Paul is really heading in this whole section, is to describe what real maturity is. They think they have it, but they are totally misplacing what is real maturity. They don't understand it. And Paul is going to end chapter 13 by describing it, what real maturity is and what they should do and how to get it.